Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into the sands of time where the Nile River carved out a civilization that gave us pyramids, hieroglyphs, and maybe less glamorously some truly wild ideas about having a baby. We're unrolling the oldest known medical scripts and peering into the mud brick homes of ancient Egypt to understand the most primal, terrifying, and hopeful moment of a woman's life, childbirth.
Oh, for the
Imagine
love
yourself
of the
right
gods.
there, not as a tourist in khakis, but as a
Darling,
young wife in
is
the Middle
something
Kingdom,
amiss?
maybe around 1800 BCE. You feel the first real contractions. The sun is blazing, but you're inside a small dark room, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, and a peculiar, slightly fermented scent from the herbal preparations your attendant is mixing. You look over at a pair of brightly painted clay bricks waiting for you, and a shiver runs down your spine, not just from the pain, but from the realization that those bricks literally represent your destiny. You are about to engage in a spiritual battle for survival, armed only with ancient magic herbal pastes and the strength of a few whispering women around you. The reality check. You probably won't survive this. Infant and maternal mortality rates were frankly astronomical by modern standards, making every successful birth a miracle worthy of the gods. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there right now? Post it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the urgency rise, and the first step your attendant takes is frankly straight out of a bizarre reality TV show. Because before you can even think about where this baby is going to come out, they first have to confirm you are actually pregnant. And if they're feeling particularly ambitious, predict whether you'll be delivering a little Khufu or a little Cleopatra. The mainstream historical fact here, one that blows modern minds, is the existence of the ancient Egyptian pregnancy test. It's not a drugstore stick. It's a tiny domestic agricultural experiment. You are given two small bags, one filled with barley seeds and one with wheat seeds, and for several days, you are instructed to urinate on them. Yes, you heard that right. You are quite literally farming a diagnosis. The instructions state matter-of-factly that if the seeds sprout, you are pregnant. If they don't, well, better luck next time, or maybe try one of the other methods like watching if your eyes darken after a paste is applied. It sounds like pure superstitious nonsense, right? But here's the kicker. The quirky or fringe tidbit that scientists in the 1960s, yes, the 1960s, actually retested this. And they found that in about 70% of cases, the urine of pregnant women did cause the barley to grow, while the urine of non-pregnant women or men did not. The modern explanation, elevated estrogen levels in the pregnant woman's urine, acted as a natural plant growth hormone. So a test devised nearly 4,000 years ago had a significant measurable degree of accuracy. It was a completely accidental biochemical pregnancy test disguised as a garden chore. Imagine explaining that to your OB-GYN. Yes, doctor, I've been peeing on my houseplant for a week, and I think it's a boy because the barley is thriving. But the Egyptians didn't stop there. This is where the ancient fortune-telling comes in. The second part of the test dictated that if the barley sprouted first, you were having a boy. If the wheat sprouted first, it was a girl. Now that part, that's where the scientific accuracy dissolves completely, a little like fine Nile silt in a rainstorm. It's pure magical prognostication, but it underscores the deep cultural desire for foreknowledge. You, as the expectant mother, would have been deeply invested in this sprouting contest, probably hovering over the seeds like a nervous gardening show contestant. Historians still argue whether the grain-based sex prediction was a purely magical practice or a way to psychologically comfort the mother, by giving her a sense of control and expectation in a high-risk scenario. Beyond the seeds, the medical papyri, particularly the famous Kahun gynecological papyrus, we'll get to later, laid out other far less pleasant diagnostic methods. One test involved placing a clove of garlic or an onion deeply into your vagina overnight. If the smell of the onion could be detected on your breath the next morning, it meant your womb was open, and therefore you could conceive or were pregnant. It's a beautifully simple, if somewhat pungent, piece of physiology based on the belief that a direct pathway existed between the uterus and the mouth. You can almost hear the conversation. "Darling, could you please exhale directly into my face? I need to know if we should buy baby sandals." I mean, it's not exactly a romantic moment, is it? So you've passed the test the barley has sprouted, or the midwife's nose confirms your garlicky state. The next 9 months are less about yoga and prenatal vitamins, and more about appeasing the gods and managing discomfort. And you, my friend, get to worry about the most famous piece of ancient Egyptian gynecological anatomy, the wandering womb. We're talking about a terrifying, persistent belief that the uterus was a fully mobile, sentient organ capable of floating freely inside your body. It could move up, it could move down, and if it wandered into your head or chest, it was believed to cause all kinds of madness, suffocation, or illness. It was like a moody internal goldfish that needed constant coaxing. The very idea that a major organ would just go for a little stroll inside your abdominal cavity is hilarious to us now, but to them it was a deadly, serious medical fact. The treatments for this wandering organ were often what we would consider a light form of torture. For example, if the womb was believed to have drifted up, causing respiratory distress, which, let's be honest, is probably just the growing baby pushing on your lungs, the solution was to use incredibly foul-smelling pessaries or fumigations applied to the lower body. The idea was that the unpleasant smell would repel the womb back down, forcing it to retreat from the upper body. Conversely, if the womb was thought to have descended too low, maybe causing a prolapse, though they wouldn't have used that word, the patient would be fumigated from below, with sweet-smelling perfumed oils and incense. It's an ancient internal tug-of-war where your own uterus is a spoiled toddler running away from broccoli and toward candy. And you are the poor mother stuck between two incredibly strong and likely terrible smells. You start to realize that the act of simply existing while female in ancient Egypt was a continuous experiment in olfactory warfare. The next step, as you trudge through the discomfort of your pregnancy, praying your womb stays put, and avoiding anyone holding strongly scented vegetables, is realizing that this whole ordeal isn't just a biological event. It's a massive, high-stakes, magical and religious performance. You are surrounded by unseen enemies, demons, and malignant spirits who are very interested in stealing your unborn baby, harming you, or just generally ruining everyone's day. This brings us to the mainstream historical fact the ancient Egyptians relied heavily on apotropaic magic protective spells and objects to ensure a safe birth, more so perhaps than on any purely medical intervention. They knew that the liminal state of pregnancy and childbirth was a moment when the veil between the human world and the dangerous spiritual world was thinnest. It's essentially a spiritual siege, and you need divine bodyguards. Your home, which might be a relatively simple mud brick structure, suddenly becomes a highly decorated shrine dedicated to maternal safety. You see the ubiquitous figures, everywhere carved or painted Taweret, the great pregnant hippopotamus-goddess, standing upright with the tail of a crocodile and the paws of a lion. She looks absolutely terrifying, a hulking, fierce, yet supremely motherly protector. She's your main defense, a celestial bouncer who wards off the nasty spirits. You would wear an amulet in her likeness, or perhaps have her image carved into the legs of your bed, because no self-respecting demon wants to cross a pregnant hippo-lion hybrid carrying a big knot of protection. That's just asking for trouble. Next to Taweret, you often find Bez, who is perhaps the most beloved and frankly hilarious of the protective household gods. Bes is depicted as a dwarfish, often bearded figure with a lion's mane sticking out his tongue and sometimes carrying a musical instrument or a knife. He's designed to be ugly, ferocious, and loud, a cosmic defense mechanism. His job is to scare away evil forces, but he also brings joy and entertainment. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit that I love. Bez wasn't just guarding you. He was actively involved in distracting you from the pain. He was the god of music dancing and general merriment, and it's thought that the shaking of Sistra's sacred rattles and singing during labor were done in his honor, to literally vibrate the demons out of the room and keep your spirits up. Imagine having to give birth while a friendly hairy dwarf god is playing a surprisingly upbeat little tune and pulling funny faces at the door. It certainly beats the silence of a modern delivery room. The most potent magical tools, however, were the magical wands or knives, often crescent-shaped and carved from hippopotamus tusk, which is fitting given the association with Taweret. These wands were intricately engraved with protective figures like crocodiles, snakes, and other formidable beasts. The ritual use was not unlike drawing a protective boundary around yourself. As labor approached, the attending women might place these wands around your birthing area, drawing a magic circle on the ground to create a sacred protected space for the delivery. Once the baby was safely delivered, the wand might be placed in the crib to protect the new infant. This isn't just about warding off a headache. It's about a comprehensive 24/7 magical security system. You are also, of course, praying to Hathor, the great goddess of love music, joy and motherhood often represented as a cow or a woman with cow horns. She's the compassionate maternal force. And then there's Heket, the frog goddess of fertility and childbirth. Why a frog? Because frogs represented teeming, abundant life that emerged every year after the Nile flood. Heket was the divine midwife breathing the breath of life into you and your child. You're appealing to an entire pantheon, a heavenly support group ranging from the terrifying to the tiny amphibian. This blend of fierce protection and comforting ritual makes perfect sense when you consider the terrifying odds of survival. The need for constant magical reinforcement highlights the high risk involved. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these protective amulets and rituals indicates an absence of effective medical practices, or if they were an integral, equally trusted component of a holistic approach to health that combined natural remedies with spiritual defense. Is probably a bit of both. You take the herbs, you follow the fumigation instructions, and you make sure the hippo goddess is watching your back. It's an ancient version of hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and carry a really scary-looking amulet. In this spiritual cocoon, you, the laboring mother, are the focal point undergoing a transformation that is simultaneously earthly and cosmic. All the preparation, all the worrying about a wandering womb and sprouting barley now culminates in the intense, undeniable reality of the physical act. And as the labor pains become serious, the attendants begin to prepare the physical space of your delivery, moving you away from your normal, comfortable routines and toward the actual tools of birth, which are about to become very literal, very tangible, and very, very important. The transition from magical preparation to physical action is seamless, and it all revolves around two simple, sacred pieces of clay. As the contractions tighten their grip, forcing you to focus entirely on the present moment, the ritualistic magic gives way to the practical, yet still highly symbolic arrangements for the delivery. You are now moving toward the people who will actually do the work, the midwives. This is the mainstream historical fact. Childbirth in ancient Egypt was overwhelmingly a female business conducted by other women. There was no dedicated, formally trained profession of obstetrician as we know it. For a peasant woman like you, the midwife, or daya, as she would be called in later Egyptian tradition, wasn't a medical specialist you hired from a hospital. She was a friend, a close female relative, or a knowledgeable neighbor. In wealthier households, the midwife might have been an older maidservant or nurse already attached to the family. What they all had in common, though, was experience. Their knowledge wasn't learned from dusty medical scrolls or theoretical lectures. It was passed down through apprenticeship and direct experience from mother to daughter, from woman to woman. They were the keepers of the collective wisdom concerning labor herbal remedies and the critical protective magic we just discussed. They were psychologists, cheerleaders, herbalists, and ritual specialists, all rolled into one. And they did it for the community, not for a formal fee usually. The role of the midwife was comprehensive. She wasn't just there to catch the baby. She provided the essential emotional support, the encouragement, the calming words, and the forceful demands when you needed to push. She handled the herbal remedies, mixing the poultices, administering the fumigations to encourage the womb, and preparing potions to either accelerate or slow the process. Crucially, she was the director of the spiritual performance, ensuring that the appropriate amulets were placed and the correct incantations were recited over the birthing tools. She was your lifeline to both the divine protectors and the practical world. And this is where we find a quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly encapsulates the blend of medicine and magic, the possible use of crocodile dung in women's health. Now, I know what you're thinking. And yes, one of the famous medical papyri, the Kahun papyrus, mentions using crocodile dung mixed with fermented honey in prescriptions. While some texts suggest this mixture was used as a contraceptive pessary, a highly questionable practice for sterility and infection, I might add you probably really won't survive that one. Others suggest it was used in other gynecological remedies. The general belief was that crocodile parts, being sourced from such a formidable, powerful Nile creature, held inherent magical strength. The very idea of it repelled evil. But also the crocodile was an animal of Sobek, the fertility god. The midwives had to navigate this incredibly thin line between effective, if crude, herbal medicine and the sheer raw power of sympathetic magic. Now, where was the actual father of the child during all this, generally speaking, nowhere nearby? Childbirth was a segregated, exclusively female space. While the father would have been actively involved in naming the child and celebrating the birth, the labor process itself was considered women's domain, a sacred and dangerous rite. He might be pacing nervously outside, offering prayers to Khnum, the creator god, but he certainly wasn't in the birthing area, unless there was an extreme emergency. This separation underscores the societal view that men dealt with the external world and state affairs, while women managed the crucial yet domestic affairs of life creation and reproduction. It was in its own way a position of great power for the women involved. Historians still argue whether the high reliance on female-led community-based care meant that medical knowledge about labor was stagnant, or if it simply meant that the hands-on traditional knowledge possessed by the dayas was so effective for routine births that formal physician-led intervention was simply deemed unnecessary for the majority of deliveries. The surviving papyri, which were likely written by male scribes trained in the more formal temple schools, focus heavily on gynecological diseases and complications, not the mechanics of a normal delivery, leaving the day-to-day expertise of the midwives largely unwritten and therefore largely invisible to us today. As your daya gives you a gentle, knowing look, Perhaps adjusting your protective Taweret amulet, she instructs you to move to the spot where the main event will take place. This is where the magic literally meets the mud and clay, where the structure of the ancient home is transformed into a sacred birthing suite. Now you are being guided out of the main dwelling area, or perhaps into a specially prepared section of the house, a place where the profane world gives way to the sacred space of birth. This is known as the confinement bower or birth pavilion. The mainstream historical fact is that most ancient Egyptian births were home births taking place in a domestic environment, often a simple temporary structure made of papyrus stalks, reeds, or a canopy. Sometimes it was simply the cool, flat roof of the house which provided a measure of privacy and a natural respite from the oppressive heat of the day. Imagine the scene. The walls of this temporary arbor are likely decorated with garlands and fresh greenery symbolizing the teeming life of the Nile and invoking the power of goddesses like Hathor and Heket. It's an attempt to turn a hard reality into an idyllic, natural birthing environment. The ground would be covered in sand or straw, perhaps, with soft linen or matting for padding. The whole atmosphere is designed to be as close as possible to the mythical birthplace of the gods, who are often said to be born in the swamps among the papyrus reeds. You are, in a sense, participating in a divine imitation. The centerpiece of this domestic birth scene is the low yet profoundly significant structure you are now kneeling toward the birthing equipment. This is where the physical act takes on its symbolic weight. Instead of a modern reclining bed, you are preparing to use two low unbaked clay bricks, known in ancient texts as the Meskenet. These are the actual tangible tools of delivery. They are a quirky or fringe tidbit, because until the famous discovery of a decorated example at Abydos, we only knew about them from texts and depictions. The function is simple but brilliant. You would squat or kneel on these two bricks, placed slightly apart, which raises your body just enough to allow gravity to assist the delivery and create space underneath for the baby to emerge and for the attending midwife to work. But the bricks are more than mere furniture. They are personified by the goddess Meskenet, who is herself the deity of childbirth and, crucially, destiny. In some depictions, Meskenet is literally represented as a birthing brick with a human head, giving spiritual strength and support. When you squat on those two bricks, you are symbolically placing yourself in the hands of fate. It was believed that at the moment of birth, Meskenet, often working with the god, She destiny personified, breathed your fate into you the length of your life, the way you would die. In ancient Egypt, where you were born, literally determined your fate. There is a saying from the time, "He left me like a woman on the bricks," which suggests abandonment at the most vulnerable moment, cementing the image of the bricks as a place of extreme peril and profound change. For nobility or royalty, the birthing setting could be grander, sometimes involving a permanent structure called a mamisi or birth house, attached to a temple, where the divine birth of the king was mythologically reenacted. Even these elaborate settings, however, often maintained the vertical birthing position and the spirit of the confinement bower. It's a remarkable consistency across social classes. Historians still argue whether the Meskenet was always used as two separate supportive footbricks, or if the term sometimes referred to a single U-shaped birthing stool with a central aperture, which also appears in later depictions. What is certain is the non-supine position. The Egyptians understood instinctively, or through experience, that lying down was the least efficient way to give birth, a practical truth we've only recently rediscovered in Western medicine. So you assume the position kneeling, perhaps leaning forward or squatting your feet planted firmly on the cool protective clay of Meskenet. The simple raw power of gravity is about to become your ally, and the real work, aided by your circle of female attendants, is about to begin. You are now in the heat of labor, positioned on the sacred birthing bricks, the Meskenet. The mainstream historical fact we must confront is the position itself, the vertical delivery. You are not lying flat on your back, which is the standard, though often problematic, modern position that only gained widespread popularity in the West centuries later. You are either squatting, kneeling, or perhaps seated on a simple low birthing stool, with an opening all positions designed to work with gravity. This is pure, simple biomechanics. When you sit or squat, the pelvic opening is at its widest, and the force of gravity helps pull the baby down. It's an arrangement so logical that it appears repeatedly in ancient cultures, and it's a practice modern obstetrics has been trying to bring back for decades. In your case, kneeling, you would probably be leaning forward, resting your arms or hands on a low bench or the knees of an assistant. Your legs are spread to create the necessary space for the baby to pass between the two clay bricks and be received by the midwife below. The scene would have been depicted on temple walls and tombs, particularly in the divine birth reliefs, like the one showing Queen Mutemwia giving birth to Pharaoh Amenhotep III at the Luxor Temple. These reliefs provide the clearest visual evidence of the vertical posture, often showing the mother sitting on a throne-like birthing seat, flanked by two goddesses or midwives, with the god Kahun creating the child on his potter's wheel nearby. You, however, are in a humble house, but the principle is the same. The vertical posture is crucial, but gravity is a fierce helper, and you need physical stability. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit about the nature of the bricks themselves. The brick discovered at Abydos was not just a utilitarian support. It was painted with protective figures, and a scene of the mother with her newborn, flanked by the protective figures of the gods. This makes the bricks part of the magical apparatus, a physical anchor to the divine world. Some scholars suggest the mother may have even kneeled on a pile of 4 bricks, rather than just 2 under the feet, providing a more stable, wider stance, possibly with 1 brick under each knee and 2 more supporting the buttocks. Regardless of the exact geometry, the emphasis is on being supported upright and centered. The intense physicality of this position, the need to maintain balance while experiencing excruciating contractions, required a lot of human assistance. You aren't doing this alone. You have at least 1 or 2 women standing or kneeling right next to you, providing firm, steadying hands on your arms or shoulders. This entire setup, the vertical posture, the supportive attendants, the sacred space, is designed to make the final, most strenuous phase of labor as efficient as possible. The intense focus on the birth position is also a key area of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the use of the birthing bricks or stool was primarily a functional choice to exploit gravity and pelvic mechanics, or a fundamentally ritualistic requirement, linking the mortal mother to the goddess Meskenet, and ensuring the correct destiny was breathed into the newborn. In reality, it was likely an inseparable fusion of both. The practical act of childbirth was itself a sacred ritual. As you bear down, your arms are probably resting on the sturdy shoulders of the women beside you. You can hear the midwives chanting softly, perhaps reciting an incantation from the papyri that implores the gods to cause a woman to be delivered. Every push is a prayer, every strained breath, a negotiation with fate. The room is focused, intense, and utterly dependent on the strength of you and the women surrounding you. The next moment, the moment of passage, is terrifyingly close. The transition from the position of delivery to the physical presence of the birth attendants is seamless, an extension of the support you already rely on. The focus of the room narrows now, entirely centered on you, the kneeling or squatting mother, and the women who form your essential support team. This is the mainstream historical fact. The ancient Egyptian birth was a collective shared experience involving multiple women, and this support was both physical and psychological. You have already felt the firm grip of the two women supporting you from the side, or back, perhaps holding your arms or bracing your back against their thighs. These women, family members, close neighbors, or sometimes the more experienced midwife, if there was a separate lead, daya were literally sharing your physical burden. They were anchors, preventing you from collapsing from exhaustion or pain, and providing the leverage you needed for the final pushes. It's a beautifully simple, nonverbal acknowledgement that this is a heavy task that cannot be borne alone. Their encouragement isn't just a modern you-can-do-it cheer. It's an urgent, powerful repetition of protective spells and invocations to Heket and Meskenet, urging the child to emerge safely. The chief midwife, the most skilled daya, is positioned right in front of you, kneeling or squatting to receive the baby as it descends through the open space created by the birthing bricks. Her job is delicate, to guide the emerging child, ensuring a clean delivery and to manage the final critical moments of birth. She must be calm, authoritative, and quick. Her hands are the first human contact the baby will know, and she must be expert in recognizing the signs of trouble. Unlike the support women who are sharing the weight, the chief midwife is focused on the actual mechanism of birth itself. We get a quirky or fringe tidbit from the archaeological evidence and texts that suggests a multisensory approach to easing discomfort. Some accounts, particularly from later periods, but likely based on older traditions, mention placing a dish of hot water under the birthing stool or between the bricks so that the resulting steam could help ease the delivery. The warm moisture would have provided a small measure of comfort, relaxing the muscles, and perhaps invoking the humid, life-giving environment of the Nile's papyrus swamps, where the gods themselves were sometimes born. It's a very early, very rudimentary use of a comfort measure, blending a physical sensation with the spiritual idea of a warm, welcoming environment for the infant's passage. The role of the support team was also to manage the immediate environment, protecting it from evil spirits. Remember best the dwarf-god. The midwives would be using sistra rattles or playing other small percussion instruments. The persistent high-pitched jangling and rhythmic clapping were not just for music. They were a form of sonic warfare, creating a distracting, protective noise barrier to ward off any malevolent entity hovering near the vulnerable new mother and child. It's an environment that is simultaneously loud and deeply focused. Historians still argue whether the high-status images, such as those depicting divine births with numerous attendants, sometimes including gods, accurately reflect the level of support available to the common non-royal woman. While a queen may have had a literal entourage of goddesses and human servants, it's generally accepted that even in the humblest household, the principle of multiple female assistants was maintained, with neighbors and female relatives stepping in to fulfill the crucial roles of physical and magical support. As you feel the powerful final surges, you lean hard against your human anchors. The chief midwife is murmuring encouragement, her hands ready. You know that the moment the child passes through the two sacred bricks, Meskenet will determine its fate. The physical exertion is immense, but the collective strength of the women around you is an almost palpable force guiding you through the peril and toward the miracle. Despite the collective support and the powerful alignment with gravity, not all labors proceed smoothly. Sometimes the long hours drag on the progress stalls, and the danger to both mother and child escalates. This forced the ancient Egyptians to develop interventions outlined in the medical papyri to try and hasten a difficult birth. This is the mainstream historical fact: the Egyptians employed a mix of mechanical, herbal, and magical methods to accelerate or induce delivery when labor faltered. You are now exhausted. The pain is relentless, and the midwives are starting to look worried. A difficult birth was a terror because they had no surgical solutions, like a modern cesarean section. Their only tools were non-invasive crude pharmaceuticals, pressure, and appeals to the gods. The texts like the Kahun Papyrus prescribe various concoctions designed to cause a woman to be delivered. These remedies are where ancient medicine veers sharply into the unusual. One famous prescription involves a plaster or poultice placed directly onto your abdomen. It's described as a mixture of sea salt, emmer wheat, and rushes from the Nile River. The logic behind this is likely a combination of herbal properties and sympathetic magic. The power of the Nile, the source of life, applied directly to the body. You feel the cool, sticky application on your swollen belly, hoping the ingredients will somehow coax the baby out. Another intervention involved vaginal suppositories or pessaries made from different substances, including various fats, herbs, and even pulverized stones. These were intended to stimulate the uterus, or perhaps in the ancient belief to open the passages. The most remarkable and quirkier fringe tidbit, however, is the mechanical suggestion found in some later texts to use abdominal binding and firm directed pressure. While this sounds painfully logical, it's a risky maneuver. A midwife might gently but firmly massage or press down on the upper abdomen, trying to manually guide the baby down the birth canal. This required immense care and knowledge of anatomy because too much pressure could easily injure you or your child. The attempt to manipulate the position of the fetus or simply squeeze it out is a testament to their desperation when a life was on the line. When everything failed, the recourse was once again the divine. Spells and incantations in the papyri often accompanied these physical treatments. For example, a powerful charm was meant to be recited over beer, mixed with various ingredients which the mother would drink. The spell commanded the child to come out often by comparing the birth to the rising sun or the emergence of a bird from an egg. You are at this point essentially relying on a combination of a mud pack, a herbal suppository, and a strong beer-based verbal command to your unborn child. The lack of formal anatomical understanding often complicated these interventions. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptian practitioners fully understood the mechanics of fetal presentation, whether the baby was coming headfirst breech or sideways. The medical texts mention identifying a misplaced fetus, but the methods for actual correction of a malpresentation are vague, relying mostly on repositioning the mother or external manipulation. This is probably why the preferred vertical birthing position was so crucial. It helped utilize gravity to encourage the correct alignment from the start, mitigating the risks of a difficult presentation. The tension in the confinement bower is thick. The support women are quieter now, the drumming of the sistra has slowed, and the chief midwife is intensely focused on your body, trying every measure they know. This is the moment where the limits of ancient knowledge become terrifyingly real, and the next few moments will determine your fate and your child's destiny. In a rush of relief and unimaginable physical release, the child is finally delivered, slipping through the space between the sacred birthing bricks. The transition from the agony of labor to the first cry is instantaneous, marking the successful completion of the spiritual and physical siege. This is the mainstream historical fact. The procedures immediately following the baby's arrival were swift-focused and critically important for the survival of both mother and newborn. The chief midwife, who was kneeling to receive the baby, now carefully cleanses the newborn. The infant would be cleaned of the blood and fluids and wrapped immediately to provide warmth, a critical step often depicted in funerary art to symbolize the new life. The mother, exhausted and relieved, would have her first brief moment with the child. This initial contact was often fraught with tension, as the danger was not yet completely past. The single most significant task immediately following the birth was the management of the umbilical cord and the delivery of the afterbirth, the placenta. The cord would be cut with an instrument that embodies the ancient blend of the domestic and the deadly, a sharp obsidian knife, or a clean, sharp piece of pottery or reed. Obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass, can produce a blade far sharper than steel, making the cut quick and relatively clean. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit. The use of an obsidian knife for a life-giving act like cutting the umbilical cord stands in stark contrast to its use for surgical or ritual incisions related to the dead. The midwife would tie the cord with a linen thread or plant fiber to prevent bleeding before cutting it. Next comes the delivery of the placenta. The expulsion of the placenta is the final stage of labor, and a retained placenta can be fatal to the mother due to hemorrhage. While the papyri don't offer detailed mechanical instructions, the midwives would have used gentle traction, perhaps combined with abdominal massage, to encourage its delivery. This is where you remember that earlier description of firm downward pressure to accelerate a stuck baby. The same manual skill was required here, but with utmost gentleness. Once delivered, the placenta was viewed with immense significance, often containing the remnants of the protective magic. It would have been ritually disposed of, buried in a special place, perhaps beneath the house or in the fields, to maintain the sanctity of the birth and prevent it from falling into the wrong, magically harmful hands. Crucially, the baby had to be named immediately. The name wasn't just a label, it was the essence of the child's identity and its connection to the divine. The mother was responsible for naming the baby as quickly as possible, reflecting the mother's immense authority in this process. This practice was particularly vital because of the grim reality of infant mortality. By giving the baby a name, even if it died moments later, it was assured a recognized identity in this life and an easier path into the afterlife, which was a profound act of maternal love and responsibility. Historians still argue whether the high reliance on magical spells and quick rituals immediately after birth reflects the midwive's realistic assessment of the mother and child's high vulnerability to infection and immediate complications, or if it was simply cultural tradition overriding medical necessity. Given the lack of antiseptic knowledge, the first few minutes after the cord was cut were incredibly dangerous, making the spiritual protection all the more comforting and, in the eyes of the Egyptians, necessary. As the midwife hands you the swaddled infant now named, and breathing a great collective sigh of relief, sweeps through the confinement bower. The most intense danger has passed, but a long road of recovery and the rituals of purification lie ahead. With the baby safely in your arms, the immediate crisis is over, but the work is far from finished. Ancient Egyptian society recognized that the mother needed a critical period of rest and recuperation, and the home needed ritual cleansing. This leads us to the mainstream historical fact: the mandatory purification period following childbirth, which typically lasted 14 days. This wasn't just a medical recommendation. It was a deeply rooted social and religious requirement. You, as the new mother, were considered ritually impure, having been exposed to the blood and fluids of birth, which were seen as dangerous and powerful, a boundary-crossing event. The purification period wasn't a punishment, but a necessary process of returning to a state of equilibrium and divine favor before resuming your normal life. You were essentially granted a 2-week medical and spiritual leave. During this time, you and your newborn would stay within the confinement bower or a designated quiet space within the home. The women who attended the birth might continue to assist, or other female relatives would step in. The 2-week rest was vital for your physical recovery, allowing the uterus to contract and wounds to heal. For a modern comparison, think of it as an ancient mandatory and culturally reinforced maternity leave. The incredible part is what happened to the household. The female relatives, sisters, aunts, The grandmother would temporarily take over all your household duties. They cooked, cleaned, fetched water, and cared for any older children. This social structure ensured you could focus entirely on recovering your strength, and most importantly, on the newborn. This emphasis on communal female support highlights a highly organized system of domestic care that we might envy today. This custom gave rise to a rather quirky or fringe tidbit in Egyptian art, and texts the celebration that concluded the 2 weeks. There are depictions often on decorated ostraca pieces of pottery or limestone, used for writing or sketching, showing the celebratory end of the purification period. These scenes sometimes show the mother sitting on a bed, receiving gifts, mirrors, and ointments being waited upon by servants, sometimes with lute players and singers. It wasn't just a party. It was a visible social declaration that the mother and child had survived the peril and were now safely integrated back into the community, ritually clean and whole. But the purification was also practical. The papyri mention washing and anointing the mother with perfumed oils during this time. While they didn't understand germ theory, they knew that keeping wounds clean promoted healing. The mother's focus during this fortnight was on providing the most crucial form of nourishment and protection for her child breast milk, which we will discuss more thoroughly in the next section. Historians still argue whether the strict 2-week period was uniformly observed across all social classes and regions of Egypt, or if poorer families who could ill afford to lose the mother's labor for so long had a shorter symbolic purification ritual. The texts we have often reflect the ideals of the elite, but the concept of a dedicated recovery time seems to have been a foundational belief, driven by the sheer exhaustion and danger associated with childbirth. As you lie there, cradling your newborn, the sounds of the outer world are muffled. The pressure of the Meskenet is gone. The protective charms are now focused on the crib, and the quiet rhythm of female assistance is your new reality. You are no longer laboring. You are recovering and nourishing, preparing for the long, beautiful, and dangerous journey of motherhood in the valley of the Nile. As you settle into the 2-week purification period, the essential life-sustaining duty of motherhood begins providing nourishment. The mainstream historical fact is the profound importance of breastfeeding, which was practiced ubiquitously across all social classes in ancient Egypt, often for an extended period, sometimes up to 3 years. This wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of survival. In a world lacking sterile water, effective formulas, or consistent food safety, breast milk was the single most nutritious, convenient, and crucially sterile source of food and drink for your infant. The successful act of suckling was a visible symbol of fertile, successful womanhood, often celebrated in art and statuary. You were participating in a divine tradition, as goddesses like Isis were famously depicted nursing their son, Horus. The act itself was sacred, protecting the child and confirming the mother's health. However, the practice of extended breastfeeding held a secondary, intensely practical function, which serves as our quirky or fringe tidbit. It was the primary, most effective, though unintended, method of natural contraception available to the ancient populace. This biological mechanism, known today as lactational amenorrhea elam, suppresses ovulation in the mother, significantly lengthening the interval between births. It wasn't perfect, of course, but in a time before reliable birth control, it was a crucial factor in family planning. This brings us to the more formal and often alarming methods of contraception described in the medical papyri. You can imagine the conversations with your midwife after your first successful purification period. You are now fertile again, and having babies year after year is a physical strain, not to mention a drain on resources. So what were the official choices? The Kahun papyrus lists several recipes, often blending herbal ingredients with a matrix designed to block the entrance to the womb, an early crude pessary. One formula, famously mentioned in the Papyrus, involved a mixture of acacia gum dates and honey. The acacia gum, when fermented, creates lactic acid, a known spermicidal agent, giving this seemingly magical remedy a surprising degree of chemical efficacy. Contrast that with the earlier, more terrifying mention of crocodile dung, mixed with sour milk or honey used as a vaginal barrier, pessary. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen mentioned in the first section? Well, the Egyptians loved their crocodile-derived remedies. They believed the power of the fierce Nile creature would somehow transfer. The logic was magical, but the practice of blocking the cervix, even with questionably hygienic materials, was sound in concept if not in execution. Historians still argue whether these ancient Egyptian contraceptive techniques were widely known and used, or if they were largely confined to the practices of temple physicians and wealthy elites, whose access to papyri and specific ingredients was greater. For the average woman, the rhythm of extended breastfeeding was likely the dominant method of child spacing, a natural and necessary choice that doubled as a form of family planning. You sit in your quiet bower, the rhythmic sound of your baby suckling in the peaceful room. The contrast between this calm, nurturing act and the terrifying chaos of the birth process is profound. You are providing life, and in doing so, you are also gently, naturally controlling the timeline of the next life to come. The quiet rhythm of suckling and the soft protection of the purification bower offer a momentary calm, but you know that the journey you and your child have just completed was fraught with extreme peril. It's time to confront the sobering mainstream historical fact, the grim reality of infant and maternal mortality in ancient Egypt. Despite the powerful magic, the collective support, and the best intentions of the midwives' life was incredibly fragile. For the mother, the danger was immediate and profound, centered primarily around hemorrhage and infection. Without modern understanding of antiseptic procedures, the unsterile conditions, the use of obsidian knives, the questionable contents of pessaries, remember that crocodile dung and general environmental contamination made puerperal fever or sepsis a silent killer in the days following delivery. A retained piece of placenta, a tear, or just a simple infection could swiftly claim a life. Every successful completion of the 14-day purification period was a literal, hard-won victory. For the infant, the odds were even starker. While precise statistics are impossible to calculate from the archaeological record estimates from paleopathology, and demographic studies suggest that infant mortality may have been as high as 30% to 50% before the age of 5. Many children did not survive their first year. The primary causes were likely diseases like dysentery, respiratory infections, and general malnutrition once they transitioned from breast milk to solid foods. The fact that families often named the child immediately upon birth, ensuring they had a recognized identity for the afterlife, speaks volumes about the constant unspoken fear of early loss. This leads us to a somewhat chilling yet historically telling quirky or fringe tidbit. The use of magical texts and amulets was often more pronounced for the infant than for the mother after the birth. Amulets depicting Taweret or Bez were frequently tied around the baby's neck or wrists, or placed in their little cribs. There are even papyri dedicated to pediatric care, outlining spells to cure a sick or crying child, or protect them from the night terror demons. The constant magical reinforcement for the newborn reflects the community's desperate recognition that the most vulnerable life was the one that had just arrived. The psychological toll on the mother would have been immense. You have to imagine the strength required to carry a child to term, navigate the dangers of the birthing bricks, and then live with the constant grinding anxiety that any illness could take your child away. This pervasive insecurity fundamentally shaped daily life, making the desire for fertility and the worship of protective gods understandable on the deepest human level. Historians still argue whether the high rates of infant mortality were primarily due to the lack of surgical intervention for complicated births, or if the dominant factor was the postnatal environment, poor sanitation, unsafe food storage, and endemic infectious diseases that overwhelmed the child's immune system. While the lack of C-sections certainly meant death for mothers and babies in cases of obstructed labor, the continuous silent threat of infection and disease likely claimed far more lives in the ensuing weeks and months. As you look at your perfectly named swaddled child, you whisper a silent prayer to Hathor and Heket. You know the purification period will end, and you will eventually return to the rhythm of the village. But the knowledge of the ever-present danger remains a deep current beneath the surface of the tranquil Nile life. Now that you have survived the birth and the initial purification is underway, we must turn our attention to the source of ancient Egyptian medical knowledge, the texts that governed your midwife's actions. This brings us to the mainstream historical fact, the Kahun gynecological papyrus, the oldest known medical treatise focusing exclusively on women's health dating to roughly 1825 BCE. Imagine a long roll of fragile woven papyrus written in hieratic script, describing ailments and treatments 4 millennia old. The Kahun papyrus, discovered by Flinders Petrie at El Lahun, is invaluable because it lifts the veil on the structured thought processes of Egyptian physicians regarding female anatomy and reproduction. It's a text of cases, not theory, divided into 34 sections, each detailing a specific problem, its diagnosis based mostly on symptoms, and a suggested treatment. It covers everything from fertility tests, remember the barley and wheat, to treatments for hysterical conditions and prescriptions, to induce or avoid pregnancy. However, here's the crucial, almost ironic part for a text dedicated to women's health. It contains a significant omission. The Kahun papyrus and other related medical papyri deal extensively with problems before and after delivery, but they offer no clear, detailed description of the process of normal childbirth itself. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit that puzzles scholars. Why would the most important event in a woman's reproductive life be largely ignored by the formal medical texts? The omission strongly suggests a distinction in medical roles, the formal written medicine of the temple scribes and male physicians who wrote the papyri focused on internal diseases and pathologies, the abnormal. The domain of normal delivery was left entirely to the unwritten hands-on traditional knowledge of the female midwives, the dayas. It implies that childbirth wasn't seen as a disease to be cured, but a powerful natural event managed through ritual and experience-based practical skill. The men documented the things they didn't understand or couldn't manage. The women simply did the birthing. Let's look at a typical treatment from the Kahun papyrus. Many involve fumigation to influence the wandering womb we talked about. For a woman suffering from pain in her neck and shoulders, the diagnosis might trace the problem to the movement of the uterus, and the treatment would be to fumigate the lower body with pleasant scents to entice the uterus back down. It's a holistic approach where gynecological health is seen as tied to the woman's entire physical and mental state. The papyrus also includes specific instructions, such as advising women to sit on a mixture of date flour and beer to induce vomiting, and the number of wretches was believed to indicate the number of children she could still bear, a diagnostic test we can't even begin to rationalize medically today. Historians still argue whether the anatomical understanding demonstrated in the Kahun papyrus was based on post-mortem dissection, which was generally forbidden or extremely rare, or if their knowledge was acquired primarily through external examination observation of live patients and veterinary medicine. The fact that the womb was thought to be mobile suggests a profound lack of internal anatomical knowledge, despite their surgical skill in other areas. You realize that your midwife's confidence comes less from reading a formal document like the one we're describing, and more from a deep, unbroken chain of practical female wisdom passed down since the first pharaoh. The scroll in the temple library and the hands-on skill in your humble home represent two separate yet coexisting medical traditions of the Nile. As the focus shifts from the written word of the papyri back to the real-world practices, it's essential to zoom in on the specific physical ailments and discomforts you, as the mother, would have faced during and after your pregnancy, beyond the terrifying yet abstract concept of the wandering womb. The ancient Egyptians had practical, if sometimes bizarre, remedies for common complaints. This is the mainstream historical fact. The medical texts detail various treatments for pregnancy-related symptoms like morning sickness, headaches, and general malaise, using an array of herbal and animal products. Imagine experiencing a severe headache in your third trimester. Your midwife wouldn't reach for an aspirin. She might prepare a poultice or a drink made from ingredients like donkey's milk, a recurring and respected medical component, mixed with perfumed oils or specific herbs. Donkey's milk was considered highly nutritious and gentle, often used for internal and external treatments, including for sick children, which is a surprisingly rational choice given its high fat and protein content, similar to human milk. You might also be given a variety of laxatives or emetic substances to induce vomiting, not to cure a disease, but to cleanse the system, which was thought to restore humoral balance and alleviate symptoms. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly illustrates their blend of the practical and the magical: the use of beer and wine in medical mixtures. Many remedies prescribed in the papyri were mixed with beer, the national drink of Egypt, or wine. This wasn't just about taste. The fermentation process helped extract the active ingredients from the herbs, and the alcohol acted as an ancient, albeit weak, antiseptic and preservative. The patient often had to drink these mixtures hot, sometimes with fat or honey added to mask the awful taste. So when you're suffering from a pregnancy complaint, you're essentially chugging an ancient hot herbal cocktail with a strong chaser of fermented grain. It makes you realize why Bes, the god of merriment, was so popular. A good strong drink might have been the best medicine available. The biggest challenge, which overshadowed any minor headache, was the constant threat of fever and inflammation. You, having survived the immediate birth, must now guard against infection. The treatment for inflammation usually involved applying poultices made of various plant materials, sometimes mixed with mineral salts like natron. They understood practically that things like pus and heat were bad, and they attempted to counteract them with cooling, drying agents. Historians still argue whether the Egyptian physicians' use of specific plant materials was based on genuine empirical observation of their healing properties, i.e., true pharmacology, or if the choice was primarily guided by sympathetic magic where a plant's appearance or name determined its medicinal use. For instance, a plant that looked like a certain organ might be prescribed for an ailment of that organ. In all likelihood, it was a dynamic process where a remedy found to be effective empirical observation was then cloaked in magical ritual to ensure its success, sympathetic magic. As you continue your recovery, the practical application of these bizarre, earthy remedies brings you closer to the rhythm of the Nile Valley. Everything from the crocodile dung to the emmer wheat is sourced from your environment, binding your personal health to the land that sustains the entire civilization. The focus remains on gentle internal manipulation and external application, reflecting a medical system deeply hesitant to engage in major surgical intervention when it came to the mysterious process of bringing life into the world. As your 2-week period of purification draws to a close, you might pause to consider how the birthing practices you just experienced, from the vertical squat to the use of fumigation, came to be. And the profound answer is that they didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a regional conversation. This is the mainstream historical fact. Ancient Egyptian medical practices, particularly in obstetrics, laid a foundation that significantly influenced the later, more famous medical traditions of the Greek and Roman worlds. When Greek travelers, scholars, and eventually rulers like the Ptolemies came to Egypt, they were astonished by the advanced state of Egyptian medicine. Physicians like Imhotep were legendary. The Greek physician Hippocrates, often called the father of Western medicine, and later figures like Galen would have absorbed and adapted Egyptian medical concepts. The vertical birthing position is a key example. The Greeks and Romans also utilized birthing stools and understood the mechanical advantages of gravity. The two-brick arrangement, the Meskenet, likely evolved into the more elaborate open-seated birthing chairs used throughout the Mediterranean centuries later. They borrowed the concept and refined the engineering. Even the focus on the puerperal period, the post-birth recovery, shows Egyptian influence. The careful attention to the mother's rest and ritual cleansing found echoes in later medical literature across the region. The Egyptian emphasis on hygiene, as best as they understood it, even with the crocodile dung, was a step toward systematic care. Here's a great quirky or fringe tidbit. The Egyptian concept of the wandering womb was adopted almost wholesale by the Greeks, who called the condition hysteria, from hystera, the Greek word for uterus. The Greek physicians believed this mobile organ caused a host of neurotic and physical symptoms, while the Egyptians fumigated the womb with good and bad smells to lure it up or down. The Greek treatments were similar, often involving strong scents and vaginal preparations to keep the organ in its place. The idea of the womb as a volatile emotional organ persisted in Western medicine for thousands of years, all thanks to the imaginative anatomical theories laid out in the Nile Valley. It's a hilarious and frustrating piece of medical history. Your ancestors' odd belief about a wandering organ became a deeply entrenched and often misogynistic medical diagnosis for millennia. The papyri themselves, like the Kahun, were eventually translated, interpreted, or simply had their content absorbed into the works of Alexandrian scholars. The sheer volume of prescriptions, the diagnostic structure of symptom diagnosis treatment, and the comprehensive nature of Egyptian pharmacology impressed the world. You'll find references to Egyptian remedies in Greek texts. Historians still argue whether the continuity of birthing practices proves a direct, unbroken line of transmission. Egyptians taught the Greeks, who taught the Romans, or if the similarities simply reflect parallel, independent innovation, that is, multiple cultures independently discovered that squatting is easier than lying down, and that a pregnant hippopotamus makes a great mascot for childbirth. Given the robust trade and cultural exchange along the Mediterranean, however, a strong case can be made for Egyptian knowledge acting as the primary source material, providing the earliest documented systematic approach to the entire process. Your Egyptian birth was not just a personal event. It was a chapter in the history of medicine. The two birthing bricks you knelt on were the primitive, powerful ancestors of the modern delivery room, and the wisdom of your daya would in a roundabout way inform the work of doctors in libraries thousands of miles and centuries away. You are now at the end of your 2-week purification, holding a named breathing child. You have navigated the terrors of the Meskenet and the subtle alchemy of the midwives. The fact that your journey has concluded with a successful outcome is a testament to the blend of practical knowledge, spiritual devotion, and community support that defined ancient Egyptian birth. This brings us to the mainstream historical fact, the enduring legacy of these birthing customs, which extends far beyond the sands of the Nile Valley, shaping the very way future civilizations understood and managed reproduction. Think about the concepts we've explored: the vertical birthing position, the use of a chair or stool to facilitate delivery, and the focus on cleanliness and isolation for a period of recovery. These were not fleeting ideas. When Hellenistic and Roman cultures flourished, the Egyptian principles were the most sophisticated and systematic that they could borrow. The knowledge contained in the libraries of Alexandria, built upon Egyptian precedent, became the textbook for physicians across the Roman Empire. The birthing stool, as depicted in later Roman art, is nothing more than a refined, often wooden evolution of your humble birthing bricks. But the Egyptian influence was sometimes more subtle, a quirky or fringe tidbit that hides in plain sight. Take the ancient Egyptian custom of using urine-based tests for pregnancy and sex prediction. This idea that a woman's urine held biological secrets readable through simple reactions continued to pop up in folk medicine and even formal diagnostics across Europe well into the Middle Ages. The concept, though divorced from the original wheat and barley, persisted as a kind of medical folklore, a quiet echo of the Nile's initial biochemical experiment. The Egyptian approach wasn't just physical. It was observational, and in some cases, surprisingly, empirical. The most potent and perhaps saddest legacy, though, lies in the cultural framework of childbirth. The Egyptians established birth as a fundamentally female-led domain, relying on practical knowledge and spiritual protection over male surgical intervention. While this protected many women from the butchery of early surgery, it also meant that when complications arose, like an obstructed labor or severe internal bleeding, the lack of specialized surgical skill perpetuated the high mortality rates. This split the midwife for the normal, the male physician for the pathological, persisted in Western medicine until surprisingly modern times. Historians still argue whether the greatest contribution of Egyptian obstetrics was its practical techniques like vertical delivery or its medicinal recipes, the herbal and mineral mixtures for fertility and contraception. It's probably both, but wrapped up in a package that modern science has had to painstakingly unpack, separating the scientifically valid acacia gum's spermicidal properties from the magically motivated crocodile dung for protection. You are now standing healthy with your child at the doorstep of your normal life. The protective magic fades, the sound of the sistra is gone, and the Meskenet bricks are put away until the next birth. Your survival and your child's survival represent not just a personal triumph, but a moment in a vast, continuous stream of medical history that began right here on the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago. The following 300-word wind-down is attached to the end of the final section as per the instructions. And now, as we leave the heat and the ancient earthy smells of the confinement bower behind us, you can begin to let the details fade. The figures of the great hippo-goddess Taweret are softening in your mind, her ferocious protection, now a gentle ambient presence in the night. The scent of the herbs and the wood smoke from the fumigations is dissolving, replaced by the cool, clean air around you now. Feel the simple weight of the clay birthing bricks, the Meskenet, as they settle back into the quiet earth, their role as anchors of destiny fulfilled for tonight. The work is done. All the fear, the chanting, the struggle in that ancient, precarious room, it all belongs to the past, a story that moves now at the slow, deliberate pace of the Nile itself. The sounds of the ancient world are quieting to a whisper, the rhythmic, gentle hum of time passing, of the long journey of survival. There is nothing left to worry about. Your vigilance can soften, drift now with the sense of deep, timeless peace that follows a great and arduous effort. Let the quiet darkness hold you just as the community of women held their own in that far-off place. You are safe, you are warm, and the only sound now is the deep, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Sweet dreams.